Okay, it's time to start. Very welcome to this seminar on safeguarding science in multilateral negotiations. What can we learn from IPBES, IPCC, and the new Science Policy Panel on Chemicals and Waste? Great to see so many here in the room. Special welcome also to you who are students, and also a special welcome to our online participants. This seminar is arranged by the Healthy Living Planet initiative, which is trying then to bend this curve through science, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and chemical pollution. And it's co-arranged with the FRAM Center on Chemical Risk Assessment and Management, and BEC, which is the strong research area on biodiversity and ecosystem services in a changing climate, which is a collaboration by Lund University and the University of Gothenburg. Okay, I'm Daniel Slunge. I'm a researcher in environmental economics at the business school. And for some reason, I don't know how, but I ended up in the steering group for all these three initiatives. I still have time to do some research, and much of that is on chemical issues and policy instruments. Nevertheless, we have a challenging theme today. We know more and more about these issues scientifically, and we see a lot of trends are going in the wrong direction. And when we think that then the policymakers will act, we see that, in fact, some of them and some interests are instead denying science. So many of our colleagues, not least in the US, feel that they are under attack. Funding is disappearing, etc., etc. And this is also something that affects multilateral negotiations. We have now a new panel on chemicals, waste and pollution, having its first meeting in February next year. And we would like to draw some lessons from IPBES and IPCC, and also the negotiations on these issues and the plastic treaty, and see where are we and how can we make science preserve scientific integrity and also make science count in these negotiations. So we have a very distinguished list of presenters that will take us through this. They will each speak for around 12, 13 minutes, maybe a question after that, but we'll have the last half hour for a panel, a discussion. And then for those of you who are here in the room, there will also be some late healthy living buns if you stay around afterwards to chat and discuss further. This is a big theme to cover in 2 hours, but we'll do our best. And we're also recording this seminar, so we can post it online afterwards. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first presenter, and that is Martin Scheringer, who is a professor of environmental chemistry at ETH in Switzerland, and he has followed very closely the negotiations of this new panel on chemical waste and pollution. So very welcome, Martin. We're very glad to have you here in Gothenburg. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the introduction, the invitation to speak here. And hello, everybody. My name is Martin Scheringer. I'm a chemist by training. I work at 2 universities, the Maastricht University in Brno in the Czech Republic, and at ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich in Switzerland. And I'm also with a group of academic scientists that we call the International Panel on Chemical Pollution. And if needed, I can also explain more about that group. Marlene in the background is also on the board with me of that group. And the group has a certain role in this entire topic. So the new panel is called the Intergovernmental Science-Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution. It was established this year in June, and it will have its first meeting of the plenary in February next year, so quite soon. Members of such a panel are countries, governments. The governments of the countries of the world are the members, and some of them are already members, not all of them yet, and they will meet in February in Geneva. For the talk today, I have two main parts. I want to look back on the process of the negotiations that led to the panel, and I would look forward to, mostly for now, its questions and perhaps concerns that we have about the panel. So the panel was established by something that's called, with a lot of jargon here, something that is called OEWG, an open-ended working group, which was established under a mandate by UNEA. UNEA is the United Nations Environment Assembly in 2022. And there's still a website. You can find all the documents of the work of the OEWG if you want to look them up. The group had several meetings. The first meeting was just a procedural meeting in 2022 in October, but then there were 4 meetings with several hundred people where actual content was discussed. And we had an IPCC delegation, and I was at all 4 of these meetings with the IPCC delegation. They were in Bangkok, Nairobi, Geneva, and Punta del Este in Uruguay. And the first important thing is that the plan was to have 3 of them, but at the third meeting, it was not possible to finalize the negotiations. There was a failure, and therefore a 4th meeting was squeezed in. As a first summary from these meetings, it was difficult. And it was also difficult because some countries really put a lot of pressure on the process and pushed very hard for their ideas and concepts, and they used what's given here at the bottom of the slide as a threat, which is nothing has been decided until everything has been decided. This means there's no progress from meeting to meeting. It could be that at last meeting, everything is deleted, removed, changed that was agreed on in the earlier meetings, in the previous meetings. So it could be that at the end, still there wouldn't be a panel. That was a threat that caused a lot of stress and pressure on everyone. There was a lot of disagreement, and that's why the third meeting failed. And always contentious is capacity building, because that's what developing countries want and need, and other countries would have to pay for, and that is always a struggle. But that is a normal thing in a way. What was much more contentious now in the context of these negotiations was, for example, the role of observers. Observers are the non-governmental groups, including us as scientists. Would we have, for example, seats on official bodies of the panel? There's something that they call the IEC, the Interdisciplinary Expert Committee, which will oversee the work of the panel. And it's a very important committee. And the question was, could observers have an official, a formal seat on this committee or not? And there were very different views among governments about that. Then also the entire structure of the panel was highly contentious. For example, there was at some time a proposal for what's called a policy committee that would even oversee the work of the IEC. So it would be on top of the IEC. So there would be a political filter of the issues that would be discussed by the panel. So that we then said, oh no, that's impossible. That's not the mandate. We have a mandate for an SPP, a science policy panel. We don't have a mandate for a PSPP, a policy science policy panel. So that was dropped. And then the question of what can scientists do in this process leading towards the panel. In addition to all of this, there was a strong sense of all these geopolitical tensions, and there was a lot of obstruction from a small number of countries. And our conclusion in a way was that multilateralism, which is the collaboration of countries in the world, is broken or even dead. Inge Andersen, the executive director of UNEP, sees this differently. She said this is a great win for multilateralism, but I think this is just something that you can say when you look at it formally, because formally, yes, there's a panel, but in terms of process and content, it's not. It was, I think, at least an indication of the end of multilateralism. We had kind of a blog or daily briefings from the meeting, so if you want to get an impression, here's our team from the meeting in Punta del Este, and we have a website where you can read our daily blog. And for day 4, we use kind of drastic language and strong colors to paint the dire situation. So that is a piece that you may have even fun to read. Although it's not really funny, but at least it's engaging. So if you go back to the topic of this workshop here, safeguarding science in the negotiations, it was really not clear what the role of science in these negotiations would be. We, of course, said we are the scientists, and this is a science like science, policy panel. So, of course, we should have a word in this. We should be at the table. But government said no. This process, the negotiations, is a government's process, and this means governments only. And we should be quiet, and we have our work to do and our role once the panel has been established. Then, of course, scientists have to conduct all the scientific assessments. But for now, shut up. We, of course, did not like that and disagreed, but it was, yeah. So we were relegated to the role of observers, to normal observers. There are many NGOs who are all observers in these negotiations. We would be allowed to speak in the plenary, but only after all governments have spoken, and if there is then some time left, then we may speak. And governments may even request that we leave the room if they feel pestered by us and if we speak too much and perhaps ask the wrong questions. So we were left with what observers can do, and this is not nothing still, and that's also why it was worth going there. We can, of course, talk to delegates in the corridors between the sessions and share our knowledge and talk to them and provide input and suggest what they should consider if they're willing to work with us. We could join what's called regional group meetings, because every day, every morning, the different United Nations regional groups, so Africa or Asia Pacific or Latin America and Caribbean, they have their closed meetings, and sometimes they invite observers to their closed meetings to learn about the position of the different countries. We could, of course, and we did work with other observers to produce joint statements that would be delivered in the plenary and discussion papers, and we would be able to share printed policy briefs, because at these meetings it's good to have printed materials, to just hand them out to people and give them to them to just read on the spot. Now, looking forward to what we may be expecting, what's coming up with the new panel. There's a website, and you can see the first documents. I just counted the number of countries who are now members, and it's about 110. And interestingly, the United States of America are not yet, at least, a member of the panel. The problem is the outcome of the OEWG meetings was very concerning, because the panel is there, but it is in a straitjacket. Because many core elements of the panel and this work are are in brackets, in square brackets. Text in brackets, and that's what governments can request. They can say, I want to have that text in brackets, means the text is disputed and legally not existent. And all of this, the rules of procedure, the conflict of interest policy and rules for that, and the process for determining the panel's work program are all in brackets, in square brackets, which means they don't exist. There is text that was negotiated and discussed at the meetings, but in the end, it was kind of annihilated. And then the key point of the straitjacket is this. It was the difficult countries kind of forced the final decision that everything that the plenary of the new panel does is by consensus, which means it gives veto power to each individual country, and this means that it will always be the smallest common denominator that will be the outcome of all the negotiations about these open, important points that need to be decided. And then just to show how bad this all was, is the last point here. There is a foundational document of the panel, and it has a preamble, and that's about the objectives. The entire preamble is in brackets. But then in the preamble, it says the purpose of the panel is to protect human health and the environment, and even that phrase is separately in brackets. So some countries remove that because it seems that for them, the purpose of the panel is to boost their chemical industry, not to protect human health and the environment. So you see extremely divergent views and extremely strong forces to make that panel ineffective for this purpose. So we are awaiting the first meeting of the panel. There are a lot of open questions. The first, of course, is, can the panel get rid of the straitjacket, and how long will it take for the panel to get rid of the straitjacket? Can they really come to conclusions and agreement on these three core elements that we had here that all need to be decided on? And what would operational actually mean? Because the smallest common denominator is small, and it could be that the panel will be operational, but it will have a very limited scope, a very small range of action it can take, and it may be very weak and ineffective. An open question also is where will the secretariat of the panel be located, which also has an influence on how everything works. And then two big concerns are the ones at the bottom here. How strong will the influence of the chemical industry be? Because we have a panel on chemicals, and chemicals is directly related to the chemical industry, which is different from climate change because there's not a climate industry. So we are much closer to a certain type of industry that feels affected by and concerned by the work of the panel. And the other question is, what will be the role for, let's say, us as independent scientists in the work of the panel? Because it may be that countries nominate industry representatives as experts to work for the panel. Just to illustrate this with my two last slides here, that here is a large group of authors, and Bethany and Marlene are co-authors with me on this paper about the track record, the bad, challenging, difficult track record of the chemical industry on conflict of interest problems. So many chemical industry actors have conflict of interest, of course, because they make money from chemicals, but they often do not declare these conflicts, and they work as if they were independent. And this, of course, undermines the process. And they have developed a lot of tactics and techniques to do that. And it's often not easy to even be aware of what's going on. And one of these tactics is to capture the process, meaning that they would have a narrative that serves their interests, but they would manage to feed that narrative into the process of, let's say, the negotiations or the work of this panel. So that everyone thinks, oh, that's the genuine narrative of our work here, but it's the industry narrative that was kind of fed into the process, into the thinking of people, that it feels natural to use the industry narrative as a general narrative. So we just published this paper here about these capture strategies. And with that, I come to the end and can say that we will have a delegation at the meeting in February, we meaning the IPCP. We will report from the meeting again in daily briefings, and depending on what's coming out, we will have to call for support for a strong or stronger panel, because we will, of course, share all of this with the scientific community all over the world, and we hope that we will find support for a call that would make the panel stronger, put pressure on governments. We may open this for signature by anyone who is interested, and we will learn from us about that when we are there. With that, I would like to thank David Azoulay from the Center for International Environmental Law, who has shared with me a lot of interesting, his understanding of the process. He's a lawyer, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Martin, for this very interesting presentation. It seems like, of course, you're not too happy about this process and all these things in bracket, even the objectives of protecting health and environment. But if you were to decide, and so this was now an excellent panel established, what would be the first assessment report you would suggest? So what would the benefits be of a good panel?
This is a good question. And I must admit, I don't have a clear answer to that, not because I have not thought about this. We have thought a lot about this question, but there's so many possibilities because there are so many chemical pollution issues in all parts of the world of very different types, and very different communities are in need of support and of clarification and assessment and then action, that it is very difficult to answer that question. And I would just, of course, pick a topic that I find important, but that would be just me. And that's also why the panel will have this committee, the Interdisciplinary Expert Committee, that would then find a way to define exactly a way to determine the work program of the panel. So I have to say, I don't want to name something specifically here.
Okay, so that's a core thing then, of course, prioritizing between different types of assessment. But I'm sure as a scientist group, you have like 3 top priorities, what need to be assessed or something.
I work a lot on PFAS, on these perfluoroalkyl substances, and they are a global problem. And I think they are something that could be covered by the panel, but that's, again, from my point of view as a PFAS expert.
Yeah. course, other ones to go into lead and mercury and so on.
Which are also relevant, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll ask Bethany to come up and take us forward into the plastics negotiation. And now I will scroll through all these slides that you can see that we do not show you, but we will show you in the procedures if you want to know more about this organization that Martin and Marlene have set up, a scientist coalition. Bethany Carney Almroth, many of you know her. She's a professor here in ecotoxicology at the Department of Biology and Environmental Sciences. And she has followed the plastics negotiations of a global plastic treaty very closely.
Yeah.
So, welcome.
And I forgot to put my name on my slide, but that's because all the things that I'm going to talk about, I do in very big groups of people. I'm just one of many. I'm starting with this picture, which is a photograph. Maybe it doesn't look like a photograph, but it's a photograph of a sculpture that a friend of mine made. The photograph is taken at a dump site, obviously, and that's his nephew in the foreground. But it's depicting plastic waste on a dump site. And maybe when you think of plastic, you think of waste. Plastic pollution as a problem, you think of garbage. Am I wrong? Do you have other viewpoints on plastic? If I were to say plastic pollution, what would you picture? Maybe something like this. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk about a similar process to what Martin was just describing. This one is specifically focusing on plastics. And I'm going to tell about a group of scientists that I'm working with that is feeding into that process. So Martin briefly mentioned the IPCC group that he works with. I'm going to tell you a bit more about a group that I'm working with. But before I do that, I just want to explain plastics as not only a waste problem, but a problem across the entire life cycle, starting with extraction of raw materials and production of the plastics themselves. So 98 to 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuels. These are from accidents of a train that crashed carrying chemicals that were used to make PVC, so before they even became plastics. And the lower picture is from a shipwreck, a ship that was carrying raw plastic pellets in Sri Lanka. And as you can see, the people on the beach there are almost knee deep in plastics. And this is before they become products. Then we have this stage of the plastics life cycle, which many of you would be familiar with. It's the consumer stage. 40% of plastics are packaging materials. The second biggest sector is the built environment. And then paint I brought in because most people don't think of paint when they think of plastics. And this is a big source of microplastics in the oceans. And then finally ending with waste and pollution. And here I took a picture from Dandora, one of the biggest dump sites in Eastern Africa, and the portion of the dump where there's a lot of textile wastes. And I bring in textiles because 60 to 70% are synthetic, aka plastics. And pollution is occurring at every single one of these life stages. Pollution, leakages of particles, of chemicals, of products are occurring across the entire life stages from pre-production. So addressing plastics pollution could arguably require looking at it across the life cycle. And this is what happened in 2022, the same meeting where the ISP-CWP resolution was decided. This resolution was also decided, and this is a resolution to end plastic pollution through an international legally binding instrument. And it does not focus only on the marine environment as other previous resolutions had, but rather takes a full life cycle approach. So a lot of scientists, a lot of actors in civil society were supporting this. We were super excited. Like, this is a strong treaty that can really address the problem. In reading the document, we saw references to evidence-based decision-making and using the best available science in negotiating this treaty. And we were like, high five, cool. But we couldn't see any mechanism of how that would be done. How are you going to negotiate this treaty with science and evidence-based decision-making? How are you going to do it? It's not in there. So we reached out to the Secretariat and to UNEP, and we asked them that question, and their answer was kind of, you guys want to do it? Kind of? Not in those exact words, but that was a gist of our conversation. But they invited us to come to the first meeting, and which was difficult to get accredited. That's another conversation. But we got a small number of us went to the first meeting, which was held in Uruguay in 2022. And we created the Scientist Coalition on the ground there with the goal of achieving an effective global plastics treaty centered around evidence-based decision-making and the best available science. We wanted to make the science available to the negotiators. And on the ground in Uruguay, we could see some delegations are filled with scientists and experts and technical advisors from different sectors, oceanographers and polymer chemists and product designers and economists and lawyers, and they have all the expertise they need to support their decision-making in the negotiations, while others are by themselves, don't have expertise, don't know what a polymer is, don't know what plastics are made out of, and are then in a much more difficult situation. So we're like, okay, there is a need for scientists in this space, let's do it. So we made this coalition. We're now, I think we're almost up to 500 members from 75 different countries. We're independent scientists, so we're academic scientists, we're scientists working in research institutions. We do have a tier of members who are our advisors, I'll show you on the next picture, who are working in civil society, but they all have PhDs and they're producing peer-reviewed science. And our scientists are cross disciplines. So natural scientists, social scientists, we also have indigenous scientists in our coalition, so broad knowledge base. And we built the coalition, and this was a process. And we worked very hard on the process of building the coalition because we wanted to have a high degree of credibility. And we wanted to check ourselves and all the work that we were doing. So we made, we have a secretariat, and those are the only people from the beginning who were financially supported, so people that were supporting us with administration. And then we created our steering committee, which is 13 members from all of the UN global regions. They're democratically elected by the membership. Membership criteria are very specific. You have to be affiliated with a research institute or university. You have to be producing peer-reviewed science related to plastics. You have to fill out a conflict of interest form, documenting your funding, and so on and so forth. And then we have our observer group, which is scientists working in civil society, and we have an advisory panel, which is lawyers and policy experts that help us just maintain a good understanding of the policy process. And in our work, we form different working groups around different kinds of plastic science. These might be questions that come to us from countries, or there might be questions that our scientists identify. We pull together teams. We write policy briefs and fact sheets, 1 to 2 pages around scientific consensus around specific questions. We have authorship criteria. We have review processes. We're very careful on what we're producing here that we're sharing with delegates. We're also reviewing documents for a number of different UN bodies that are related to this process, so providing scientific critique of other documents. One of the most important things we're doing is communicating with policymakers. So our target audience is the decision makers, the delegates, the negotiators, and we do this through bilateral meetings. We'll sit down one-to-one with country representatives. We might do it in regional groups like the African region or the Gulag. We do it with sharing our documents. Sometimes we have meetings with ministers trying to help them understand negotiating this space where science is really important. And again, we have very strong conflicts of interest strategies because we're trying to avoid false solutions. We're trying to help negotiators understand where safer and more sustainable paths forward might exist versus regrettable substitutions or sort of traps. Lock-in mechanisms continuing along the same path that we've been on. And of course, we're also publishing scientific papers because we're scientists, and that's what we do. This is what the process looked like. The resolution itself gives a mandate for 5 meetings, and they were supposed to be completed at the end of 2024. We are now in 2025, we're not done. But you can see the meetings INC 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here in different countries. And speaking of jargon, open-ended expert group, which is in Thailand. There should have been more of these meetings, but they were not. They were blocked in the same manners that Martin was describing. And right now we're in 2025, or the end of 2025. There was an extra meeting in Geneva this summer. There's another meeting planned in February, again in Geneva. Soon is the UNEA meeting, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, where plastics are not really on the agenda, but will be discussed a lot in the sidelines. But in this entire process, there have been important groupings coming out, high ambition countries that really want to do a lot to solve this problem. The first group of them was called the High Ambition Coalition under leadership of Norway, Rwanda, Peru. Then other groupings have emerged, calling themselves the 100+ or the Coalition of the Willing. And then there's the like-minded group. Self-named, they don't have a homepage, but they refer to themselves as a like-minded group. These are petrostates, generally speaking. It's difficult for us to know exactly who's in that group, but something like that, maybe 20 countries. And they are doing a lot of these blocking tactics, procedural tactics, just under consensus to just block progress. That's why we haven't really finished. Then there are other important groups, observers that Martin was referring to, civil society members, CSOs, indigenous peoples, my group, the scientist group. There's been 60 or 70 of us going to the meetings, so we're quite a significant presence and can cover a lot of ground, a lot of different kinds of expertise. There are other scientists there, but I think we're the biggest group like this. And then business interests. The petrochem industry is also there. The fossil fuel industry is also there. And we're seeing this as problematic because they are undermining our right to science. This also came up in the previous talk. In how we understand problems and how we understand the threats through a number of different tactics, through institutionalized understandings of knowledge and environmental science, what kind of science is being done, how it's being participated in, what's being funded, corporate capture, which you already heard speak of, limiting the scope of research and policy discussions, or weaponizing science to create agendas. This is all happening in these spaces, and it's not new. This has happened a lot for the past 70 years. The tobacco industry, together with the fossil fuel industry, sort of invented these tactics, and they're applying them very thoroughly also in this space. And this has also been raised by the Human Rights Council, and the High Commissioner recognized this problem and is calling on states to support science. We also heard earlier that there's a lot of countries where this is being problematic, where science is being undermined in a lot of different ways. But states have an obligation to support science if they are part of the Human Rights Agreement, or declaration, which most of them are. And there have been a lot of conversations around conflicts of interest within UNEP, but how industry is infiltrating and undermining this process. So this is from early on in the process. And one of the first documents that was produced by UNEP on the plastic science report and how we can end plastics, that had a very problematic framing towards waste, which is the first slide I showed you, and not looking at the full life cycle, which is what the UN determined anyway. And there were questions about how much industry influence there was over this UNEP report and how much other science was being ignored or denied. And when we got to the meeting in Canada, speaking of industry influence, this is what the airport looked like. It was completely plastered with pro-plastic propaganda, and every taxi in the city was covered. Their presence is massive. It's everywhere that you look. And they're not only using this kind of propaganda, they're also spreading disinformation, using tactics of influence through lobbyists that are reaching out to governments, that are talking to ministers. Some countries that are tied to the petrochemical industry are also using their sway to threaten countries in different ways. There have been many incidences of scientists being harassed and intimidated by petrochemical industry representatives. And there are indications of corruption within UNEP that has been written about in a number of newspaper articles. Here I'm showing you one of them. So I'm just going to finish off with an example of why it's important for us to be there in the room, or in the corridors, at least, if we're blocked from being in the room. And that is because disinformation is being shared in these spaces. And this is some of the examples that we've heard, like chemicals are already regulated. We don't need to do that here. That's not the case. 1%, maybe 6% of chemicals in plastics are regulated right now. There's not enough evidence on microplastics. There's 20,000 papers on microplastics, or that human health impacts are not in scope of plastics pollution. So then we have to tell them why and how. So we can pick up on disinformation. We hear it in the room, and then we know, okay, this is a problem. We have to do something about this. So we can share our policy briefs. Here's our policy brief on microplastics, or here's our policy brief on human health. Read this. Or we can just flag, hey, that thing that country X said, it's not true. Here's the truth. Here's what science tells us. Here's the evidence. And we can have that in a conversation in the hallway, or we can send a message on WhatsApp. And if we're not in the room and we can't hear those things, we can't help fight against those things. So that's an issue. And we also use our social media during the meetings to sort of, sometimes you can't talk about what's in the things that are happening in the spaces if they're under Chatham House rules, but we can lift issues. We can say like, hey, do you want to know about what research says about this question or that question? And we can put it out and share it. And we have newsletters as well that are followed by delegates and politicians, scientists, of course, and journalists who are also important in spreading science and messages. So we're there, we're active, we're reactive, we're sharing science, we're doing it in a very personal way, like face-to-face meetings, talking to people, which I think is really important. And I'm not going to talk more about that now. Happy to answer questions later. But we do have a QR code if you want to see any of what our outputs look like. So you can find our link tree there.
Thank you so much, Bethany. A very, very interesting presentation. Every time I meet you, almost, you are coming back from one of these international meetings. And I wonder what you think about kind of how is academia set up for being this active and responding to these working groups with kind of quick facts, etc., etc. Most of my colleagues, at least, they are quite slow in kind of, you know, we sit and work and then we write the paper and so on. How does this match?
Yeah, so we're not doing new science in the coalition. We're relying on existing science. So, I mean, research takes time and it's a very slow moving beast. But I can say that I have extremely dedicated colleagues and we're around the globe. So there's always someone working 24 hours a day. We have someone who's online and working. So that's part of it. But I think really dedicated scientists that understand the need to be reactive. And we're noticing that our science is being taken up, that negotiators are using our science for their positions. They're using it to help build their positions in the negotiations. And when the treaty essentially fell apart this summer and was rejected, it was rejected because it did not align with science. It had been too watered down, important obligations had been removed, and it would not be able to fulfill the goal of ending plastic pollution. So a lot of countries stood up and said, we're rejecting this because it doesn't align with science. This doesn't align with evidence. So I think that's a bit of a motivator. But to your other question about academia, this kind of work is not always merited within academia. We could have big discussions about the role of a scientist in society in knowledge creation versus implementation of our knowledge into society in different places. Ongoing discussions, I think, and the kind of work that I'm doing here is definitely not for everyone. Most definitely not for everyone, but for the people that are interested and have the skill set to do this, or have been taught the skill set to do this, because you can learn a lot of this, I think there should be some way of creating more incentives to do this. I think it's really essential that scientists are doing this work.
Okay, thank you, Bethany. We might get back to that in the discussion. Thanks again. So now we are moving into the third presentation, and we're leaving plastics and chemicals and moving into now another abbreviation here, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And with us here, we have Marie Stensteke, who is a professor in human geography at the faculty, the business of business, economics and law. Very welcome.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to talk some experience from IPBES. And when I listened to Bethany and Martin, I just realized that it's a long way to go with the pollution platform I see. So some of my comments are kind of course above where you are right now. So bear with me that. And so I was for more than 7 years the co-chair of the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES, as it's the shortening, which means that is the group of 25 people, scientists from all over the world that were kind of responsible for the scientific coherence of IPBES work. And we also selected the authors for now it is 14 assessments that have been published by IPBES, but compared to IPCC, we're still young. It was inaugurated in 2012, and this far has come in one global IPBES assessment equal to those that have 6 from IPCC, and the second one has just started. I will say something about the organization. So I said it started in 2012, and just to see what kind of a body it is, I won't describe all the green patches here, but it's kind of led by you could say the parliament, the plenary, where representatives, members from, the members are states, nations from all over the world. Then for now it's 145 members, and they gather one time per year-ish in big halls to take some decisions. I will come back to what later on. But the main bulk of the work of IPBES is made in what's called the expert groups and task forces, and that they kind of make the assessment is 52 or 60 to 140 persons, depending on the size of the assessment. and they are also supported by task forces in various themes, for example, knowledge and data, scenarios, indigenous and local knowledge. And you see the multidisciplinary expert panel and the bureau. I won't go into detail, we kind of oversee the work of those. And there is, of course, a secretariat that is important for how things are done. So about 2,000 scientists and other knowledge holders from all over the world have been participating in IPBES assessments. Now, coming to experience and how to keep scientific integrity, I have circled, I'm very bad writer, sorry, bear with me that, but in this pinkish fine colors, what enhances scientific integrity generally? And I come back to what it does for me as a human geographer, a social scientist in a natural science dominated field. Well, sorry, this is a scheme to show what is the work of the flows in the work of IPBES in an assessment process. There are kind of other pieces in the work as well, but this is surely the bulk work. And the big circle up to the whatever in the corner, suggestions from members, goes down to the plenary, who then decides on doing a scoping of some kind of a theme. There's a scoping report that's going, you see the arrows, down to expert groups that works with peer review systems, coming back, negotiated the text word by word, and then decided, well, let's do a full assessment. And then again, going through MAP and Bureau down to selecting experts group, number of reviews, coming back to the plenary, and the summary for policymakers is negotiated word by word. De Liang recognizes this well because the IPBES has borrowed a lot from how IPCC is set up. What is important then, and thinking about, you see this structure, and I put rules and procedures with 3, whatever you call it, those marks after is, because in order for all this to flow and to keep it from being corrupted or too much vested interest, it's so important to have this, what I first thought very boring thing, rules of procedures set. I just realized I was a naive Swede when I kind of thought it was just waste of time. But it's so important to keep who has the responsibility, how are experts nominated, how are they selected, who have the mandate to comment where, how are these suggestions coming down, how are negotiations run, what happens if there is, what's the alternative if it's difficult to find the consensus and so on. Lots of things in the process, very much necessary to set up kind of keep the scientific integrity through it. So rules and procedures is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I would say. Then this process with making scoping documents that also peer-reviewed. Scoping documents is kind of maybe a 10-page document that sets what should be in this. Well, number of experts come together and decides on a, you can call it a synopsis. This is what it should be about. These are the chapters. These are the expertise we should call to it. And that is then negotiated by the plenary. And the plenary then consists of people from the governments, both scientists that could be in the national delegations, but also the majority policymakers from various levels. And having this scoping document makes a kind of a scientific credibility to what and how could an issue be assessed. And then with the decision from the plenary, it comes back again to kind of the scientific community, or the appointment of experts that work on these for regular 3 years, coming back to the plenary. But what is important then, and this is my last point, I mean, I try to take the most important bullet points, is that there's a summary for policymakers produced, 30 to 40 pages on the report, which is really not a full, it's not equal to a summary. It is kind of summary that are with the most relevant issues for the policymakers. And then there is what's called the chapters, which means the scientific assessment, so to speak. So for the global assessment, for example, I think it's 1,752 pages. It's really the scientific stuff. And the summary for policymakers is also written by the assessment expertise, sent to the plenary, and then negotiated between the expertise, the leaders of the assessment, and the governmental representatives there. But it's crucially important, and this should be in the rules and procedures. It's not the scientific text that is negotiated, but it is the summary for policymakers. And the summary for policymakers must be coherent with the results in the assessment chapters. What could happen if there are countries that don't want too sharp text, and I guess that's regularly happen. I guess I'll read it when I see the IPCC reports as well. The summary for policymaker gets more shallow to get the language you can agree on, but it cannot counteract, and you can't add anything that's not in the summary for policymakers in the assessment chapters. And besides that, to the students, I could say, if you're looking for material and interesting stuff and good references, it's not in the summary for policymakers you should look at, but go to the assessment chapters. That's very rich material to see. I won't say more about the process, but some just recent experiences. I think IPBES has done a good start. There's certainly still some issues, and maybe this is, you're not there with the pollution yet, because I recognize that with the businesses and the corporate sector you have issues. But I for the last plenaries, when I've been in the Swedish delegation, not in the lead of IPBES, so to speak, it's an issue with a tight regulation to the Convention on Biodiversity. I see it's a problem for the integrity of science if it's just kind of a deliverances to the convention. You need to have some kind of scientific integrity also towards the convention. It's not just to fulfill the Montreal global biodiversity framework. Need also to be able to critically assess if it's a good one. What happened at the last IPBES, which was IPBES 11 in Windhoek, Namibia? It was very clear an increased politicization of the debates. I think that's just the beginning, and probably we'll see it in others. It was a huge country that objected to the word conflict anywhere in the documents. Though it's already in the global assessment, the conflicts is one of the causes, drivers for loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And there were another quite big country when it came to the nexus of climate change, biodiversity, health and food, that really didn't want to have imprints that stopped their bioeconomy for expanding a lot. So that really caused a nuisance in the negotiation. I was lucky not being in that stream, because it was one of the what's called nexus assessment, and I was in the group with Maria Widemo from Naturvårdsverket on transformative change that went much smoother. But the other ones, they took days and days, much longer, because of this with the consensus. There were objections. And finally, that was the result. But it really can question how to get around this consensus, or are there other ways, and could that be written into the rules and procedures? Because that will hamper the discussion. And the huge country promised to be more active in IPBES for the coming IPBES or plenaries. So it's just to start think, how can we handle this? Well, what IPBES has been working with, and you mentioned indigenous and local people, it's to include other worldviews, other ways of looking at knowledge. It's not so much about if they're species or not, but it's also how to take care of what the goods or the services, the contributions we get from nature, and how to value the different pieces there. And why is this important? Maybe I should say especially to IPBES. It's shown in a little figure in the middle, where it's shown that 35% of the, approximately 35% of the land areas on the globe are kind of traditional indigenous lands, and equally 35% of the protected areas are in indigenous protected lands. I think that's not here, that's Amazonas, but that's totally wrong, of course. If you think of where we have our national parks in Sweden, the 90% in Sami areas, or in the north, maybe even more than 90%. So surely that's also how it's run here. And that's why it's also important to have free prior consent, to have what IPBES has established, a system of workshops, how to share the knowledge, respectfully so. Challenge to scientific credibility that I have focused a bit on since I'm a qualitative social scientist, that is the inclusion of social science and humanities in assessment that have kind of a natural science starting point, which you cannot really say. I mean, it's quite naturally for climate change, for pollution, and for biodiversity. But the issue then, I mean, to find solution and to, as for the issue of biodiversity, get peace with nature is not more understanding about nature, but we really need to understand humans and the human society and that kind of logic. Then it's tricky that kind of the practices and tools and understandings are kind of have a natural science bias. So what is knowledge, what is evidence, and so needs to kind of be rethought. Organizational structures is also an issue, since most of the kind of national focal points and where communication streams goes is to a natural science context, and that also needs to be challenged and rethought. Also challenges structures and influence in academia. In IPBES, we came up with, in the first global assessment, or when the regional assessment started, that with respect to indigenous and local knowledge, we need to broaden the concept from ecosystem services to nature's contributions to people. To be more inclusive, to recognize that what serves to someone is not to another one, that to show conflicts and so on. Within academia, that was a kind of, it still has not settled fully. It's not that we are not agreed that we need to put the things, the functional ecosystem forward, but this who owns the topic, that's a challenge. And the challenge of understanding what is knowledge when it comes with soft knowledge that you don't put figures on, and how to include that with those scientists that are used to everything has to be measured. That in itself has caused a problem. It's not easy to recruit people from social sciences and humanities, since they kind of feel that skepticism. And I mean, this is not just in the past. I was yesterday where there's going to be a new multidisciplinary expert panel elected, and I was in an IPBES meeting with the Swedish delegation, with Europe delegation yesterday, and the new candidates presented. One was an associate professor in economics, and afterwards one of the delegation said, well, there were 3 good candidates, and then there was an economist. That's not a scientist. This is something I skipped a bit. What happened in IPBES that we formed a social science humanities network and to strengthen that profile. Is the final last slide, or lost the time? Yeah. Well, keep flexibility in approaches once you start, because flexibility is a good word for collaborating with various perspectives, various suggestions, various ideas, and things you haven't expected. Patient, it takes time. Sorry to say that, but IPBES, as I told Daniel and Bethany, there was a something the unsuccessful first tried to start a biodiversity panel, IMOSEB, initiated by France, that didn't fly. So this was the second try, IPBES. And I think you have said it before, but be prepared for tactics. That's usually not where we are a little bit tactics as academics, but this is on a completely other level, the professional tactics. And then I'm not talking about businesses, also within governments, the tactics is yeah. just be aware of it, and you will never be able to detect all of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marie. Very interesting. Just a very brief question. You mentioned that the increased politicization within IPBES, was that in relation to these negotiated summaries, or is it also something you see among the teams writing the assessment reports that?
I'd say, and I think we are more lucky than you're the issue of pollution and chemicals. We don't see that much. I mean, in the teams, it could be scientific differences, and both on any sides. There are many ways to not get agreed. But no, this was when negotiating the summary for policymakers. So all the teams have kind of kept together, delivered something. Maybe some have left, but that's not political reasons. But here, and I guess compared to what you mentioned, the businesses are incorporated in what the countries pushes for in the negotiations of the summary for policymakers. So it was on that level, and then, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So now it's a good time to stretch a little bit while we are connecting up with China here. For our fourth presenter is based there. He's also very well known here. I think I need some help here to get the presenter up on screen and the presentation. Is that possible? So we can not only hear the presenter, but also see him. And the presenter I'm talking about is, of course, Professor Deliang Chen, who is a professor in physical meteorology at Tsinghai University in China, and also here at the University of Gothenburg. And as I understood it, you were just here and are now back in China. Let's see, we didn't have time to try here the sound here, but very welcome, Deliang, and let's hope we can hear you.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it's working.
Perfect. Yes.
Yes. Very nice to be here. And I was in Stockholm yesterday, and for a few days to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Anthropocene concept, developed by Professor Paul Crutzen, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. And actually, all the global change, climate warming, global warming was actually a result of the human activities. So that was a very, very, very important event. But also, I can tell in a few days, I will be back in Stockholm again for celebration of Volvo Environmental Prize this year, because I'm on a jury. And this year, we are giving a prize, Volvo Environmental Prize, to a person who discovered actually the big industries strategy for misinformation, disinformation about climate change. And you should know that already in 1970s, these big enterprises, they already knew about human impact on climate change, but they organized a lot of activities to mislead people. So that was a quite interesting history. But listening to the previous speakers, we can see also, you see that in other issues, you also see this type of activities going on. I'm happy to tell that IPCC is a little bit earlier and also has been dealing with all these kind of issues for a long time. And relatively speaking, it is much more mature, the process I will describe a little bit later. So personally, I have been involved since the third IPCC assessment report. So about 20 years actually have been involved in IPCC process. In the last report, I was one of the coordinating lead authors. So next. So when we talk about the scientific integrity within IPCC, maybe we have to think about what is scientific integrity and also why it is important, and how IPCC safeguards integrity. But also I think there are still some challenges, especially this one, the coming one, the upcoming one, the seventh report is really challenging, as I can see. Next. Next. Yes. So what is integrity? I think you need to have so that's very quick. Okay. So IPCC has been used as a reference for global climate knowledge, and also has really been used in high-level policy decisions, also in the public. As at the same time, it has been also critically assessed by political and public communities. But there is also a lot of misinformation still growing, actually, and different tactics. And we know now, basically, there is a system of tactics to mislead people and also to discreditize the scientific knowledge. And so we also see that there's a need, of course, if to create a trust, we have to really show a demonstrable integrity. So that's why I think we need to think about this topic. Next. One of the principles IPCC has been following, which I think is successful story. Maybe our previous speakers talking about chemicals, talking about pollutions, maybe can think of. And I think IPCC has been really tactic and smart from the very beginning. And they said, okay, we are scientific bodies, and we are creating something that is policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. In other words, we separate the science and negotiations clearly, which is, some people think this is too conservative. But I personally, I have been seeing this actually from both as a scientist, but also as a not politician, but I have to tell you that I acted as a director of International Science Council between 2009 and 2012. And the International Science Council is a global umbrella organization for all science, representing science in the UN bodies. So I was kind of representative for global science for some years. In that capacity, for example, I have been really heavily involved in creation of IPBES. And also I have seen many of the political discussions, if you want. And I was also actually representing science in IPCC governing body as an observer. So I can see also how governments discuss issues. And I personally feel this is something we need to think carefully. That is, scientists should not be too much involved in the negotiations. And I think that will be helpful because negotiation is something else. And we scientists, we are humans, we have our biases, we have our ideological basis, and we have our discipline bias, etc. But organization like IPCC can do it. In other words, a group of scientists can do that, I think. But the individuals, I try, as a climate researcher, I try not to be very much involved in a debate because I knew that my limits. But if you want to refer to science, I think if you refer to IPCC, it's much more powerful. It works much better also. So I think IPCC has been good, but a little bit conservative maybe. And that with that it means that you need to have really credible evidence. You also have a balanced and comprehensive evaluation, not just some critical aspects. You have to be covering the whole range of different dimensions. It also has to be transparent and traceable. And then, of course, the consensus in the UN settings, consensus is important. We know consensus can be very difficult because, as somebody said before, one person or one single country can basically kill the whole discussion. And but on an international level, this seems to be the only way. And so, and finally, that you need to have reviews. And for IPCC, not only you have a scientific review by experts, but also have government reviews, which is a interesting experience. I will tell you a little bit later. Next. So already in the selection of authors, and there was a very careful kind of balancing act. And UN tried to select authors from different countries, and then also there's a quite good, I think, screening of the conflict of interest. IPCC has been really developing procedures for doing that, and it's better and better. And then, of course, the whole report has been reviewed by both scientists and the governments. And there's also a summary for policymakers, SPM, and which is actually has to go through line by line approval of governments. And many people has been critical to that, but I feel like this is a good process because we scientists sometimes write in a way that we think is scientific, but actually it's not easy to be understood by somebody else who is not in the research community. So this line by line approval is really good because it does not really change the content, but it changes the formulations. And just give you one example that when we talk about anthropogenic influence on climate, we have formulated very complicated sentences in the past. But in the latest report, it was such a formulation which is very powerful, and which says the impact of human activity on climate is clear. So it's very simple, but I think it's very powerful. We formulated it in a very complicated way previously, I think. And also we have to show all the comments we received. For example, for one chapter I was leading, we received something like, I think, let me see, 8,000, I think, comments from the public. And so everybody can leave a comment. And we also have to answer each of them and then also put on the website. So then also there is a very good procedure, but also heavy procedure to make sure that the chapters are using same expression and so working in a consistent way. That takes time, actually, a lot of effort, a lot of meetings. Next. And what is, I think, fantastic with IPCC is that it has, over time, has developed a language called confidence level and a likelihood scale. So when we say it is likely, then we associate this with a number, with a probability. And for example, 70% probability this is true. And so there is a very well-calibrated language, which is very useful. Otherwise, when you say it is likely, it can mean different things to different people, different governments. It also has a very much stress on multiple lines of evidence. You cannot just show one thing. You have to really to show the different lines of evidence. And there's also, if there's no enough data, then we also rely on expert judgment. But it has to be well documented, how many experts you have invited and what they say, how many are for, how many are against, etc. And also it has been a lot of effort on avoiding the overconfidence or misrepresentation, because I think the group wisdom is a way to kill all this. Next. And another thing IPCC has learned a lot, which I think the other assessment maybe can learn, is that we were very clear that we will use the so-called peer-reviewed literatures only in the beginning, and then for some point it was not easy, so we use very limited so-called gray literature. And but even that, IPCC, if you remember, made a mistake in the previous assessment. They cited one of the gray literature, I think was from Greenpeace, but I'm not very sure now. Anyway, it's such an organization, NGO, who claimed that all glaciers in Himalaya will disappear in 2035 or something, which turned out to be wrong. And also then they traced back and found that was the only literature supporting that statement. It was not the scientific literature, it's just the advocacy. So I think that is a lesson learned, that we have to be very careful with gray literature. And also there is a very careful procedure in avoiding, for example, self-citations, because all the lead authors, coordinating lead authors, they are experts. They have a tendency to cite their own papers. So there's a very careful check on that. And there are limitations, which I think is also very, very good because we have to really avoid any bias from even scientists. Then the multiple line of evidence from observations, models, paleoclimate, and theory has to be clearly laid out, which is what. And then finally, I think this is something we learned over recent years, that we have to really have a regional representation. This is different, I guess, from the IPBES, for example. IPBES from beginning many of the issues are regional, but the IPCC work in the beginning is global warming, global change, etc. So there was not enough emphasis on the regional representation. Okay, next. So, and also there's a lot of effort to avoid the confirmation and framing biases. For example, discipline. You need to get people from really different disciplines who has quite often different worldviews. And the region imbalance is mentioned already. And so we can do more kind of documented way. It's more like structured survey, perhaps cross-checking. You need to have to show the documentation or systematic review of the results, etc. Next. And by the way, that how to do this, IPCC has really every time in the beginning, there's a training course for all the authors actually. Not only how to avoid biases, but also to be aware of different knowledge system, for example. And when you're working internationally, we have to be really careful in selecting our words. When we address to different people, we also have to be respectful, think about the cultural difference, etc. And all this IPCC gave training and also communication. Each of us, this is something that IPCC has learned since 2009. You all remember there was a so-called Climate Gate event that some hackers went into the email system and basically discovered some sloppy expressions of the writers, which can be interpreted that we are creating data and arbitrarily, etc. And so we receive all this type of because people were watching us very carefully as a writer. So unfortunately, 2009 that was very close to the Paris Agreement, but then when this came out, then the public lost trust, and the negotiation did not went well. Although all the heads of the states were there in Copenhagen, if you remember. Obama was there, the Chinese Prime Minister there, and everybody was there, basically, Angela Merkel, etc. But still did not really successfully reach agreement, partly because of that. So communication is very important. But also we have a governmental review that introduces some sensitivity. But the IPCC has managed, I think, that process pretty well. And we agree that we will talk to the governments, delegates, but of course, we are ready to change our wording so that they understand what we mean. But we will never change the facts or to change the scientific findings. And that is not easy, but it has been very successful, except last time. If you read the sixth report of IPCC carefully, you will find that there's no single word mentioning fossil fuel, because one country has been really strong to ask we to remove fossil fuel from the report. That's funny because the whole report is about the consequences of the use of fossil fuel, but we cannot use the word. So we had a lot of discussions, and in the end, the science community said, okay, we remove the word, but we don't change all the facts. So people will understand anyway it was caused by use of fossil fuels. It's very strange, but without that compromise, probably the report will not be approved. Then we have even bigger problem. So this is a challenge, of course, and we need to be ready to sometimes compromise, but also to set the limit of the compromise. Next. So for the next report, the seventh, there are already some challenges. In the scoping meeting, Marie was talking about the importance of scoping document, but this time it's very strange. One government did not send the official delegation, so we'll see. And so the scoping document was not really fully agreed by everybody. And so there's other challenges. For example, I think nowadays many analyses are done by AI or with help of AI. So there are a lot of issues associated with that. And also now we have more and more data. Data is an issue. We are increasing the resolution of models, and then which produce a huge amount of data. And not every country has a capacity to access or even to analyze the data. And that will create, I think, a more regional imbalance, basically. So basically, rich countries have all information, but the poor countries probably will not have the information. That was already the case, but with the increase in use of AI and big data, that will be even more. Actually, you never came up with a report recently about this issue in general, that the use of AI and big data creates bigger gap in the world, to divide the world even more. And also we know that we still have a lot of misinformation and politicization. That is still the case. And so at the same time, people ask for the data, transparency, and the code is easy, but the data is not easy to make it accessible for everybody. Next. So there are also some opportunities that we can really work in an open source way and ask more global source participation. And I think IPCC is aware of cross-chapter issues, and they are all even cross-working group issues. As you know, they were divided into 3 working groups, and historically they have been working separately. But this time I was looking at the scoping document, they decided to really do this chapter, the working group, in a consistent way. And which means they need to have a lot of interactions, a lot of working together, which is also a challenge. There are also a willingness to improve the uncertainty communication even more, and also to better synthesize the model and observations. So we'll see how this will happen. I think I'm almost to the end. Next, maybe one more. Yes. So, takeaway message: the process is important. We need to have a procedure which ensures the transparency and the rigor. And but we see a lot of challenge growing for the upcoming AR7. And the integrity still is a key issue. It must be proactive. And finally, we hope that the strong integrity will build the global trust, which is needed for the global agreement or implementation of any meaningful policies. So I stop here, and maybe then we can discuss some of the points you are interested in more. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope you can hear the applause here all the way from Gothenburg. Thank you very much, Deliang. I think we'll save questions for Deliang to the discussion. And now we move straight into our last presenter. Perhaps, Tinga, you can help me to get... here we have Kerstin Stendahl. We can see you here also on the screen now. So very welcome, all the way from Finland, I believe you are in. And Kerstin Stendahl, we are so happy to have you with us. Now we have listened to these 4 scientists, and Kerstin is has worked a lot with science policy panels, and she's now at the Ministry of Environment in Finland. And Kerstin is the former Deputy Secretary of IPCC, but she has also worked for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, based in Montreal, and also worked as a Deputy Executive Secretary of the Basel and Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions. So you have experience from all these three policy fields that we have been touching upon now. So we very much look forward to your reflections. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. I would have loved to be in Gothenburg. It's actually, I've never been to Göteborg, and I would have loved to visit you, but next time.
We'll invite you another time then.
Thank you. And also thank you very much for a really interesting seminar. It's been really nice to catch up on what's happening at the moment at the science policy domain, in the science policy domain, especially when it, of course, I have heard from colleagues on both the plastics negotiations as well as the pollution panel. But it really was very interesting to hear your reflections on it. And as noted, yes, indeed, I worked on. So I will come at this now from a slightly, maybe also practical point of view, having looked at some of these processes from inside. But at the moment, what I am doing is I am working as the Special Envoy on Environment Security, and I'm also now the OSCE's, the Organization for Security and Collaboration in Europe. I am the Special Envoy on Climate Security. So I have moved my focus a bit towards how is it that environmental security now comes into play when we are looking at the state of the world. And of course, in so doing, you also very quickly come across the global context, the shape of multilateralism at the moment. And what we have heard from the speakers before me today is very much about how we have been able to establish IPCC, we have been able to establish IPBES, and we have been able to do so. We have created these panels with quite strong and sturdy rules of procedures. We have addressed conflicts of interest. We have really tried to distill the integrity and authority of scientific advice. We have also thought around who is this advice for, who do these assessments serve, and of course it's about governments, but at times it's also about the international processes and how they move how the assessments move international processes forward. And I think, of course, IPCC is an excellent example of this, with it being established in 1988. In 1992, we had the first Rio conference, where we then decided to have a convention on climate change. We decided to have a convention on biodiversity, and we also looked at desertification. And then, of course, along came Rio Plus 20 in 2012, where we very much also relied on assessments to look at how to format and formalize the notion around sustainable development goals. And then, of course, the Paris Agreement, again with a push from the assessments by IPCC. My time in IPCC was during a rather charmed time of IPCC. It was when the 1.5 report was produced and published, and we also had 3 special reports on land, on cryosphere, and oceans. So in that sense, we had a sturdy package of extremely well publicized reports that were also, again, affecting the mood of the world. We saw the youth springing into action in a very different way than we've seen before. And there was an acute and urgent need to respond to the problems that science was telling us we had. Maybe we can move to the next slide before I go too far in my musings. So just to recap what you have already heard, it's about authoritative scientific assessments. And we've heard about the integrity of the processes. In order to achieve just that, it needs to be an authoritative voice. And we need to have the institutional processes, the institutional factors, the institutional elements in place. We need to know what the structures are, what the mandates are, who is doing what in our processes. And then we need to bear in mind, and this we have also heard during the previous speakers' interventions, that there will always be geopolitical power imbalances, and both non-state actors, but also the state actors might affect the balance between scientific independence and political negotiation. We heard a very good example just now about the use of the term fossil fuels. Next slide, please. So what are then the risks to scientific integrity? We have a risk of agenda capture. And this again was referred to when it comes to the scoping documents. What are the issues that we want to address and which ones would governments rather not discuss? The conflicts of interest, and I think this is something that also during IPCC, I mean, IPCC is very mature by now. We are coming up to its 40th anniversary in a couple of years from now. But also its conflict of interest process has evolved and matured, and I think there is much more keen insight into how it is being implemented. There are communication constraints. Because of science and the way science is being produced and is being also communicated, there sometimes is it places limits on clear prescriptive advice. And you can hear from governments, but also citizens, that sometimes what is really, really wanted is a clear notion of what it is that needs to be done in order to address a problem. And this is, at times, there is a limit to that. And I remember very well when we, during the 1.5 report process, we organized a meeting in an African country where we also then decided that we would go into the community and have a sort of a village discussion around what it is that the IPCC was doing during the 1.5 process. It didn't really work because the questions that the villagers had were, of course, extremely concrete. They could see what was happening around them due to climate change, and they kind of needed to know what now to do. And this is where, of course, the science policy constraints come in, because the scientists can point to some of maybe some of ways forward, but that advice is put out just as it is, as advice, whereas then policymakers need to make the hard decisions. We talked about geopolitics, power asymmetries, and I think at the moment also what we have is a problem, and I will come back to it later on or in a little while, where it's also now about how does in a world where we can see the space for civil society, the space for science shrinking. It also means that those people that we should be talking to now are maybe not as connected to the processes that they should be. We have also talked a lot about how is it that our citizens' ability to take in this kind of information, how well does that function at the moment? And then, of course, disinformation, we've heard about it, a huge problem, and one that is difficult to tackle, goes back again to that we need extremely rigid, well regimented processes within our panels. Next slide, please. So the mechanisms, again, I think I hear I'm repeating what has already been said: the transparent review processes, conflict of interest policies, independent funding streams. How is it that we can, in, again, another shrinking domain where where countries are cutting back on official development assistance, on which is usually where also this funding for panels come from. How can we still avoid situations where the funding comes with expectations? And then inclusive knowledge systems. I think IPBES has done an excellent job there on indigenous and local perspectives and bringing it into the fold of assessments. I would here also, when it comes to inclusiveness, I would also want to point out that, and this was also during my time at the IPCC, IPCC started looking very in more detail into how also gender and gender balance of within the science community that was servicing the IPCC, how that had evolved, and of course there was the conclusion was that there needed to be extra efforts, and of course this falls back to national governments to make sure that they include in their nominations female scientists. The other one where it was also where quite a lot of focus was on the north-south divide and how it came to be that we had a certain or the balance was in favor of scientists from the north, and where we could also hear from the scientists from the global south that sometimes they would feel quite intimidated coming into this setting, and there again a lot of effort was put into just making it easing their participation in the panels. And then next slide, please. This is something that I wanted to just, there are a couple of things that I wanted to, when we look into the future, or actually the future is now, and this comes back to the question about also the pollution, the Chemicals and Pollution Panel, and the fact that it is not set up by scientists in the same way as IPBES and IPCC. And I think there is a question about parity here as well, because what we are now, and this is very much when we are looking at this from a security point of view, the triple planetary crisis means that the links between climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution need to be addressed. They are, of course, problems in of themselves, but they also interact in ways that we need to understand. The other issue at the moment is how can we deliver findings, assessments, recommendations swiftly enough in a world where we are looking at very fast-moving environmental threats. And then, of course, inclusivity and diversity of knowledge. And this is, again, about also the buy-in from the population at large, which brings me to my last slide, please. And I am really sorry, we can't really see what I have written here. So I will try to alliterate for it. And this is about just transition. It's about relating science to equity. It's about the fact that all of us in today's world can feel the effects of the triple planetary crisis in one way or another. It affects our livelihoods, and it also endangers future generations' rights. So this means that we would somehow need to also, as scientific panels, try to simplify the complex systems that we are faced with. We would need to build trust in science, and I think this is really, really important in the geopolitical situation we're in, because these are the people that are the voters that vote for governments who then come into our panels to negotiate. And these are the people who will need to feel included in the dialogue. They will need to understand that what the scientific panels are doing is something that will make their life better. And I think this is something that how we communicate it, of course, it's very much about the governments, how they include, how they prepare for the different processes, how they include citizens in those processes. It's about, of course, what you are doing here today. It's about these kinds of discussions in universities, but it's broadening it up in order to get the buy-in from the people that first and foremost will be affected by what is happening at the moment in our world. I would leave it at this. I would thank you very much for allowing me to be with you today, and very happy to take part in any Q&A. Thank you.
Yes, I hope you hear the applause here from Gothenburg. Thank you so much, Kerstin. It was a very, very nice reflection and connecting these different streams here of the other presentations also. So thank you so much. I would now like to welcome all the presenters